Well, to my two attendees, any chance you guys went to the React workshop thing that was like right before this? Oh, you did? So this is going to be like the complete opposite approach to the way React kind of looks at like front end and like full stack development. If you thought like the use state and use effect and all that fun stuff was kind of complicated and weird, then this might be a little bit more up your alley because it's very simple, right? But yeah, it'll be fun. There's lots of great HTMX memes. So if you like memes, then HTMX is a great great library for you. Let's clean this up. Have you guys looked at the hack pack, the GitHub repository, any of that stuff? Yeah. Cool. Actually, let me actually know what it's, or no. I'm going to start from scratch. Do you guys have GitHub accounts that you're signed into? Because the way that I'm going to be doing it is through GitHub Codespaces, which is like an online IDE that looks exactly like VS Code, just to make things easy for everyone. Start. Sure. Actually, go to the slides first. We've got another HTMXer. Very happy. Great.
So thank you to those that showed up for this workshop.
Publius sapient.
There we go. I'll start with you.
Awesome. Thank you very much for that great introduction. Like he said, my name is Jeremy, and here I'm presenting to you Hypermedia and HTMX, a different approach to full stack development. Now, who here is familiar with like web development, has made a website or a full stack app or something in the past? So we've got a few hands. typically the way we handle these things is we have a separate back end, a separate front end, and we communicate between those two services via JSON. And what I'm going to be sharing with you today is a different approach to full stack development that we call hypermedia driven applications. And although that sounds extremely nerdy, and there is in fact a lot of nerdy theory behind it, there are actually some really great benefits to this approach, including the fact that it's often a lot simpler to develop these types of applications. So for me personally, I really like back-end development. I'm not so much a fan of React all that much. So, when I found out about HTMX and this approach to full stack development, really it came to me as a breath of fresh air. So I'm hoping, through this talk today, I can inspire you all to learn a little bit more about this approach to developing full stack applications. Oh, this is not working. There we go. So, like I said, my name is Jeremy. I'm a software engineer currently at Reese LLC in Troy, Michigan. I've developed software for a variety of companies throughout my time. I'm the former president of the University of Windsor's Computer Science Society. So I served there for 2 years where I gave, probably dozens of talks on cool technologies like this. I am a very avid hackathon enthusiast. Like mentioned before, I co-founded the WinHacks and Border Hacks hackathons back in 2020, and those were the first major hackathons that we had at the University of Windsor. And probably the most important part of my experience is that I strongly dislike React. So if you're like me and maybe you came from that earlier workshop today and you saw that and it's like, what exactly is a use effect and a use state, then you're in good hands here. At the bottom, you can see my GitHub and my LinkedIn. Feel free to connect. I'm always happy to connect with smart, cool people. But yeah. So let's go over a quick agenda. And actually, before I do that, right up here at the top right, you'll notice a GitHub repository link. At some point throughout this workshop, you should go to that link and just have that repository handy so that when we do get to the interactive session, you have that up and ready. Very quickly, we're going to have this quick intro. Then we're going to move into what exactly is traditional full stack development. So like I mentioned, that like React, and then we've got a Ruby on Rails server, or like Svelte and like a Flask server, something like that. After that, I'll dive into what are these hypermedia driven applications that I mentioned to you guys before. And then I'll give a brief intro into what exactly HTMX is and how it fits into that. And then the majority of the talk is going to be, an interactive demo where we're going to create a full stack application with full create, read, update, delete functionality so that you can see kind of, with very, very little code, how powerful we can get, especially without JavaScript. So again, workshop code is here. You should have Python installed if you want to run this locally, but we're going to be using GitHub code spaces. So as long as you have the GitHub repo and you have a GitHub account, you'll be able to run it easy peasy. So some prerequisites to this workshop, because there are a couple. You should be somewhat familiar with web development. So you should kind of know, like, okay, what exactly is HTML? Not even really CSS. We won't really be writing any CSS or JavaScript. And you should have experience programming in at least one programming language. So we'll be using Python for this because it's very, very simple and not very verbose. So we can just kind of get the point across. But if you have experience in Java, you have experience in Go, whatever, it'll be pretty easy to kind of figure out what's going on. Nice to haves is experience building a REST API. So you kind of know what a GET request is, what a POST request is, things like that. Having an open mind is also very helpful because, like I said, this is a very different approach to full stack development than what you might be used to. And of course, having a distaste for the current JavaScript ecosystem is very helpful because this approach to full stack development really just throws a wrench into the traditional ways that we develop these applications. So what exactly is traditional full stack development? How do we develop these apps currently today, and how did we do it in the past? So I'm going to be discussing two different concepts: multi-page applications and single-page applications. So there's a difference there, and I'll kind of go through how that works. So what is a multi-page application? This is the old way of developing full stack applications. And this is where every single interaction you do with your web app is via like a link or a form. So if you look, and it's a little bit blurry, but here's our client, here's our web browser, right? We go to our website, so we go to google.com, right? Our server sends back some HTML. So we go to the site, we get our web page, everything's cool. And then the only way that we interact with it is via a form or a link, like an A tag, right? So we do some link or some form, we send that data to the server, and then the server responds with HTML again, which is great. But the key here is the full page reload, right? So if you've dealt with an old school application before, you would notice whenever you do anything on the website, the whole thing refreshes, right? This is the old way of developing apps. We don't really do it anymore, but it's important to understand how they work because it'll be relevant later on. So as you can see, we use forms and links. The server returns back HTML, and we have a full page reload whenever we do any sort of interaction. So what is a single page application? So these are our, React and Express, our like Next.js or, Svelte and Flask, things like that, where the first part is the same, right? We go to our google.com or whatever it is, and we get a web page back. The difference here is when we make a request, we do it via something called AJAX. And I won't get into the specifics of that, but basically what we're doing is using JavaScript to make requests to our server asynchronously and then return back something and then update the page without having to do a refresh, right? So the key thing to understand here is we're making a request to the server, but we're not having a full page refresh, and we're letting JavaScript do all the work so that we can have different things show up on our page, right? So as you can see, we use AJAX. Key thing here, we're returning JSON normally from the server, and then you'll notice when we return that JSON, we don't refresh the application. And so the client will create HTML from that JSON. So you may not have seen that exactly from like the React talk before because it kind of abstracts that away from you. But you probably fetched something from an API and then grabbed that data and then returned some HTML. So that's JavaScript doing all that heavy lifting, right? But there's a better way, and this way is called hypermedia driven applications. And I like to say that it's the best of both worlds between an old school multi-page application and the modern single page application. So here's our familiar client server. So again, first part's the same, right? We go to our google.com, we get our web page, right? Cool. But you'll notice, like a single page application, we use AJAX to make requests to our server. And what that means is we're not bound by just using forms and links, right? Like buttons can make requests, or there's a whole bunch of different things you can do on your front end to make these requests other than just forms and links, right? But what you'll notice on the server, instead of returning JSON, we're returning HTML. So this is very important because the HTML can easily just be swapped out without having to do a bunch of extra work on the front end with JavaScript to actually render that into something useful to the user, right? So you'll notice we're using Ajax. So there's a bunch of different ways we can make these requests. The server's returning HTML instead of JSON. And then you'll notice on the client, there's no full page refresh. So we're getting the same good user experience of a single page application with none of the complexity of having to, deal with JSON and rendering HTML based on that JSON on our front end, right? So you get a lot of good things from that. So summary, multi-page applications, old school, right? Full page reloads for every interaction. They kind of suck to use, right? But they're stupid simple to make. Single page applications, much better user experience, dynamically updating the front end, right? But they're more complex to develop because we've got our separate back end, our separate front end. We've got JSON in between, and then we've got to have JavaScript convert that JSON into HTML, and it's just a mess, right? So enter the hypermedia-driven application, which in this example we'll be using HTMX. And this is where we have server-rendered HTML rather than JSON, and partial updates, dynamic updates on the front end via Ajax with no JavaScript that you have to write, right? Now, this is a little bit theoretical, right? I've thrown a lot of terms at you, and it may not seem, if you look back at these diagrams, it may be difficult to kind of see the value of this approach, but you'll kind of see when we get into the code what this actually looks like in practice. And you'll notice how really simple it is to build, something very similar to what you would have made in React earlier. So what is HTMX? The key point of this talk. So this is stolen from htmx.org, which is a great website. HTMX gives you access to Ajax. So remember, Ajax is making those requests to our server via JavaScript. CSS transitions, WebSockets, and server-sent events directly in HTML using attributes. And that's the key, is we're using attributes within the HTML to define the behavior. So you can build modern user interfaces with the simplicity and power of hypertext. HTMX is small, so it's 14 kilobytes when you minimize it and zip it. There's no dependencies. It's got many extensions, and typically when you use HTMX over something like React, you can reduce your code space by 67%. Right? That means you're writing 67% less code, and you have to deal with 67% less code that you have to maintain down the line. So this is huge when you're developing something more complex. You have much, much less code that you have to write, and it'll also allow you to go much quicker when you're developing things. So this is kind of what I wrote. Rather than using JavaScript or something like React to define how we interact with the web page, so we use like an event listener or whatnot, or a hook or something to deal with state. Instead of all that, we just do it right in the HTML. We encode that information directly into the HTML via attributes that start with HX, and you'll see what that looks like on the next slide. An important note, HTMX is backend agnostic. And what that means is it doesn't matter what backend language you're using. We're using Python. You might really like Go, or you might really like Node.js. You can completely use whatever backend you want. And HTMX doesn't care. As long as you can ship HTML to the front end, then you're good. And a key thing to remember when going through all this is that the whole point of HTMX is swapping out HTML with other HTML, right? So we click a button and we want to swap out that button with something else, right? Or we might want to swap out another thing on the page with something else. And when you think of your applications in this swapping mentality, you'll realize how simple it actually is to build really good user interfaces. So here's a quick code example to show how HTMX works. So all you need to do to get set up is just have a script tag directly in your HTML that just imports the HTMX library. So you've got no NPM that you need, you have no build step that you need, no TypeScript, none of this tooling that you would typically need for like a React application. You don't have all this boilerplate, you just have one script tag to get it set up, right? Very, very simple. And then you'll see this button, we have two attributes on it. We have HX post and HX swap. So what this says is when we click this button, we want to make a request to our server, a post request specifically to the /clicked endpoint. And what we want to do is grab the HTML that the server sends and swap out the button element with that HTML. So we might return another button that just says I've been clicked, or we might return, a Rickroll image or something, or, pretty much anything you want. So in a minute, we'll get into the interactive demo and we'll kind of see how this actually works. Again, make sure you check out the GitHub repository and, follow along if you like. But what exactly will we be making in this? So we'll be making a simple blogging application with, key features being the normal create, read, update, delete, right? So you should be able to see all the blog articles. You should be able to click on a single blog article. You should be able to create a new blog article, delete articles, and edit existing articles, right? Create, read, update, delete, very simple. If you can build an application that does this, you can extend that and do much, much more down the line. So when you're building your hacks over the next few days, keep this in mind, right? Because you can extend it to do a lot of cool stuff. So we'll be starting with a very basic skeleton with a lot of the like HTML and stuff written out for you and like the database stuff, because we don't care about for the purposes of this workshop. This workshop is more focused on how we use HTMX in the context of an application like that, right? So let's get coding. Okay, so before I started, I just want to briefly mention, check out the hack pack, which is listed somewhere on Slack probably. Has a lot of really cool stuff. So check that out. You're going to want to go to the GitHub repository. So who here does not have the GitHub repository open who wants to follow along? I'm seeing no one, so that means everyone has it that wants it open. So just quickly going over the README. So this is the starter code that we're on right now. I have a sample finished code that you can check out. So if you want to just run the ending code, or if you're trying to follow along and you can't, we have the sample code available for you. And then what I've also done is showed a PR, which shows you the changes that we're about to make. So as you can see, we write about 50 lines of Python maybe. We change a couple lines of HTML here. We write a little bit here, write a little bit here, change one line here, change one line here, blah, blah, blah. Not a lot of changes are being made, right? So we're not actually going to be doing a ton of coding in this. But what you're going to see is how this very, very little coding is actually able to transform our application into something that fully works, right? So what we're going to do, go to the repository, make sure you're signed in, hit the code button, go to code spaces. So there should be a code spaces tab, and hit create code space on main. And what you'll notice when we do this is that a web version of Visual Studio Code should open up. So we'll give it a second. Should be relatively quick, but now what you should do once it's opened up, head to the app.py, and you'll notice a pop-up that goes up. Do you want to install the recommended Python extension? And hit install. That'll just make our life a little bit easier. So now to give you a quick overview of the code, and I'll make it a little bit bigger for you guys. Okay, so we've got a few folders and files that we need to look at. Actually, firstly, is the size okay for everyone? Guys, good, okay. So we've got the static folder here, and this you don't really have to worry about too much. This is just static assets. I've got Bootstrap in there, I've got HTMX in there, and some other stuff. This is just static assets that you would just want to be able to serve and import in your application in some way. We won't really be worried about that. This templates is where we write all of the HTML. So we have a layout.html. And what you'll notice is in Flask, we have a very special type of HTML syntax that we can use. And you can see that from this. So what this layout.html does basically is we can have multiple pages, and we don't have to copy like this nav bar and these imports and stuff. So it just makes our lives a little bit easier. You don't really need to worry about that for the purposes of this workshop, but it's just worth noting. Our index.html, that's our home page. We're going to list all of the blog articles out. And we have a button, of course, to create a new article. We have our article page, which is going to be like when you click on an article, we're going to show the content and show an edit and a delete button and all that fun stuff. And then lastly, we have two forms, one for creating a new article and one for editing an existing article. All right. Very, very simple stuff, just an input for the title and an input for the content. Very simple stuff. Lastly, we have our app.py, and this is where we're going to be writing all of our backend code in Python. I've done a lot of the database work and some of the initialization stuff that you don't really care about too much for the purposes of learning HTMX. But what's important to note is that our articles have an ID, so that's how we uniquely identify them in our database. They've got a title, as you would imagine they would. We've got content, which is markdown that we write for the blog articles content, and then they have a date, right? Very simple. And then we've got some helper functions that I've written. Get article from request, we'll use that later on. Get articles just grabs all the articles from the database. This section here is where we'll be writing all of our code, and those are our routes. So this slash is telling us when we go to our web application, localhost 5000, whatever it is, slash, we return the index.html template, right? And then here, you'll see when we go to slash article slash some ID for that article, we're going to grab the article, we're going to set the content to the markdown, which you don't have to worry about, and then render the actual template. Cool. Yeah, and then this stuff you don't have to worry about. Okay, so let's get this running now. So let's open up a terminal. We'll run Python 3 app.py. And you should notice something on the bottom right that says your application, blah, 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 and you'll see an open in browser. Click the open in browser because you'll need, it makes a really weird URL, but you kind of need that to actually run it. So you'll notice we've got a very nice blog, which for whatever reason, ChatGPT only generated recipes, but we can click on it. We can see nice blog articles. edit and delete buttons currently do nothing because they're just placeholders. And then the new article doesn't do anything because it's just a placeholder, right? So any questions, any issues getting to this point right now? Cool. Okay. So the first thing we're going to do, because it's actually the easiest endpoint, is the delete functionality. So we want to be able to hit this delete button and then it delete the blog article and then show something to the user, right? So when we delete this article, what do we want the user to see, right? Well, we would probably want the user to not see the article anymore, and then maybe some message that just says that the article's been deleted, right? So let's do that. Let's go back to our app.py, and down here, we're going to create a new route for delete. So we're going to do @app.delete, because this is going to be a delete route, /article, and this needs to be a string, /article /int ID, like that. Then we're going to do def delete article ID. Okay, so now what do we want to do? We want to grab the article based on this ID. So I'm just going to copy this code here. Now we want to delete it. How do we do that? Well, in this example code here, we're using Flask SQL Alchemy. And in Flask SQL Alchemy, we have this DB variable, which represents our database. So we do db.session.delete article, and then db.session.commit to commit our changes. So at this point, we've made a request to our server, we've grabbed the article, we've deleted it, and we've cached those changes into our database. So all that's left now is returning something to the user, right? And remember, with HTMX, we return HTML. So in this case, let's just return an H1, which is a heading, right? And successfully deleted article. So at this point, we have our delete endpoint working, right? So let's run our app again and refresh it. And there we go. So let's hit delete. And oh yeah, we forgot, we actually have to tell the delete button what to do, right? We have to tell it to hit that endpoint. So how do we do that? Let's go back to our article.html. This is where our delete button is. We have to add two different attributes to it. So the first one is hxDelete. And this is HTMX's way of saying when you click this button, we want to make a delete request to this endpoint. So we do /article/ and then we do this double curly brace. So that's Flask's fancy HTML syntax to be able to pass in like a dynamic value. So we do article.id, right? So now we say when we click this button, we make a request to this endpoint. So now let's refresh this and let's hit delete. And we have successfully deleted article, but it went inside the button, right? So this is how HTMX works. If you don't tell HTMX where to put the response, it just throws it in whatever called that endpoint. So what we want to do is tell it where the content has to go. So let's go back. Let's go to this one. When we hit the delete button, where do we want the response to go? We probably want it to go in this like big rectangle that we have here, right? So let's do that. In the context of our HTML, that's this article body div, right? So we use hx target. So this is going to say, where do we want the response to go? What's the target of our response? For that, we do hash article body. So this is a CSS selector. You don't have to worry about it too much, but the hash means we're grabbing the ID. So the element with ID article body. So now let's refresh this a couple times. Let's hit delete. And you'll notice we had no refresh on our page. We deleted the content from the screen and we've put the response, that H1, where we want it to go, right? So delete done. So we've got of CRUD, create, read, update, delete. We've got read and we've got delete. So now let's handle create, right? So we have this index.html, right? We have this button, new article. What do we want to happen when we hit this button? Well, normally we would think we want to see some sort of form on the screen, right? So that we can create our article. So let's do that. Let's create a new endpoint. And let me do this at app.get. So this is going to be a get request /article/new. This can be anything, but this is just what we call it. Def new article form. And all we want to do is just return that form create HTML, right? We want to show the form HTML. So we're going to do return render template form create.html. And that's all we need to do on our backend to have that show up, right? What we need to do now is say, okay, when we click that button, we want that to show up, right? So how do we do that? Well, we want to do an HX get to make a get request to grab that HTML. So HX get equals /article/new, which is, that endpoint we defined earlier. Where do we want this to go? Probably in that same container div, right? So we put it in this articles area div. How do we do that? Same as before. We do hx target is equal to hash articles area. All right. So now let's run our backend again in the terminal and refresh it. And now when we hit new article, it should show our form, right? Beautiful. Now, what do we want to do when we submit this form, right? So we want to grab these values, right? Hit submit, and then it goes to our backend, creates it, and then returns some response to the user, right? So let's go to our app.py, and let's define that endpoint, right? So we're going to do a post request /article, right? Because we're just going to need to hit an endpoint, give those values, and then create a new article. So we're going to do def create article. And so how do we grab those values? Well, I've created a very handy function, get article from request. So this is going to grab all those values from the request and return an article response. So now we have to add that article to our database. We're going to db.session.add article, and then db.session.commit to save that. And then what do we need to do? Well, we need to have some response for the user. And let's just return an H1, make it very simple, and say created article. Cool. So now we have to actually hit this endpoint when we submit the form, right? So we don't only use HTMX for buttons, we can also use it for forms. So in this case, let's go to our form create.html. Let's go to the form and we'll do HX post. So we'll make a post request / article. And what that does is when this form submits, it's going to grab all the named inputs and it's going to send all those values as a post request to / article on our server, right? Now, as always, we want the response to go somewhere, right? Before we were using the HX target, but in this case, let's do something different, right? Let's just say we want to get rid of the form and we want it to just replace the form, right? So if we recall with that button example earlier, by default, if we don't say anything, HTMX will just put it inside the element that calls it. And what we call that is HX swap. So by default, HX swap is equal to inner HTML, meaning when we make a request, it goes inside whatever called that request. In this case, we want to replace the form. So instead of inner HTML, we're going to make it outer HTML, right? So we're going to make a request to / article when we submit the form. It's going to return some HTML back, and we're going to replace the whole form with whatever that HTML is, right? Let's see what that looks like, and we'll run our backend once again. And let's just refresh this. Let's hit new article, and we'll do hi and hi, and we'll submit it. And you'll notice we have our H1. We have our created article. Beautiful. Now, that isn't the best user experience in the world. So what would we probably prefer to have instead of just an H1, right? Well, you'd think we're on the home page, right? We hit new article, we create a new article, and we'd probably want to go back to that home page, right? To see what's back in there. And we can do that very easily by just creating a new template. So we'll call this articles list.html. And we're just going to copy this here, which is the code that we did in the home page to show all that code, the list of articles and the button and all that. And then we're going to add a success message at the top. Let's do that. Let's copy and paste that in. Then we'll make a div. So let's make it dot margin to, padding to, let's make it rounded, and EG success means green background. These are just bootstrap classes. You don't have to worry about that. You can use an H1 or whatever you want. But we're going to say created article, right? So now let's go back to our app.py, and instead of created article, let's render that template that we just created. So return render template. What did we call it? We called it articles list. And there's one thing we're missing is we have to tell Flask what articles we're passing in. Because if you recall, we're iterating over the articles, right? So we just have to pass them in. And this is just a Flask thing. So we're going to say articles equals get articles. Great. So now let's go back, hit new article, hello, hello, submit. And you'll see we have our created article, our success message, and everything else looks just like the homepage, like normal. So this is very cool. You'll notice now that we can create a new article again, and you'll notice we're not having any full page refreshes when we do these things, right? The only time we have a page refresh is when we go to a completely different page. But what I'm going to show you next is how we can actually minimize that. And this is going to seem like magic. So it's a pretty cool thing that you can do with HTMX. So like I said, see up here the little logo, right, in the My Blog. When I hit a particular article, you're going to notice that it actually refreshes, right? So you'll see it refreshes and it does a full page refresh. Everything changes. And that's fun and all, but it's not really great for the user, right? Because when we do a full page refresh, we have to do a lot of work in the back end that, in something as a small scale like this, you don't really notice it. But on a much larger scale with a lot more assets, it's going to be a pain in the butt. So to remedy this, all we need to do is add one attribute to our body tag in our layout.html. hxBoost equals true. What this means is whenever we click a link, instead of it actually like going to that page, it's going to use Ajax, so it's going to use JavaScript to make that request asynchronously without refreshing it all, and then dynamically update the body of the page with whatever has changed, right? So what this is going to look like is when we go to this hello, we're not going to see this refresh. See? And you'll notice the URL still changed, but it doesn't feel like we've gone to a different page because there's no full refresh, right? So this is mimicking the same user experience you can get in something like React in literally like 8 characters or 9 characters in your code base, right? So you don't need your React router, your tan stack router, any of that fun stuff. All you need is an HX boost to get 90% of the way there, right? So very, very cool stuff you can do. The last thing that we can do here, and we don't have a lot of time, but I'll go over it kind of quickly, is the editing functionality. It's very similar to the rest of it, so I won't go into it in too much depth, but similar to before, we hit the delete. When we hit the edit, we want a form to show up here, right? So let's go to our app.py and create a new endpoint for that. So app.get, and this is going to be /article/int ID /edit. So we can have a form pre-populated with all those values when we go to edit it, right? So def edit article form, and we'll pass in that ID. And let's copy this because I don't like writing what I don't have to. So we've grabbed the article, and now we just need to render that edit form with the article passed in. So form edit.html, article equals article. So now when we hit this endpoint, we'll respond with the appropriate HTML that we want. Last thing we need to do here is actually tell the button to make that request, right? So I'm going to copy this because it's mostly the same. It's not quite the same. Firstly, it's a get request, not a delete request. So we'll change that. And it's /article/ID/edit. Put in our app.py. So let's rerun our backend. And now, when we go to edit, we should be able to click this and have a form show up. And just like that, we have it, right? So, and you'll also notice and I'll go to maybe a better one. So I'll hit edit, and you'll notice that the values are pre-populated as we would expect when we go to edit something. We don't want to have to rewrite it from scratch, right? Now, what do we want to do when this is submitted? Well, we would probably want to hit submit. It makes those changes on the database and then see some response on the front end, right? So let's make that endpoint. So we're going to make an app.put because that's typically what we do is a put request for when we want to edit. And this is going to be /article/int ID. Same as always, def edit article. Pass in the ID. So now what do we need to do? We need to grab the article that's associated with that ID from the database. So we're going to call this existing article. So for this ID, we're going to grab it from the database so that we can modify it and then cache those changes. And now what we need is what is the new article data? What did we get from that form? So new data is equal to get article from request. So now we have our existing article, which is from the database, and we have the new data, which is what the user put in the form, and we need to update the existing article to have this new data. And so we're going to do that very simply by just changing the title and then changing the content. Let's change that to content. And now all we need to do is make sure that those changes are saved in the database. So db.session.commit. So now we've edited the article and it's all saved in the database, all that fun stuff. Now all we have to do is return something to the user, right? So as we always like to do, let's return an H1, just saying edited article, right? We have to actually call this, right? Same thing with the create article form that we did before, right? How we had this. Let's do the same thing for our edit form, right? So in this case, we're making a put request, right? Because that's what we just defined. So hx put is equal to /article/article.id. And same thing as before, let's swap the outer HTML so that we just replace this form with whatever it is that we want, right? So hx swap equals outer HTML. Just like that, with two attributes, we've changed the behavior now of this form. So let's rerun our backend. And we're going to refresh. And we're going to call this meat stir fry, even though there's no meat. And you'll see we've edited the article. Let's make sure it actually did that. And you'll see when we go back, get meat stir fry, and it's what we expect. Now, again, something you might want is instead of it to just say edited article, it actually shows the full article details. And you can do that very easily by just copying what's in here. I'm not going to go through that just in the interest of time. But as you can see, if you look at the changes we've actually made, we've done very little, and yet we've added reactivity and interactivity to our web application, and we've written zero JavaScript, right? If you show this to someone, they would have no idea that there's no JavaScript being written because, it feels as smooth as a normal single page application, right? So that's about it from the code side. Before I kind of share some extra resources and wrap up a little bit, any other questions, concerns, things that don't quite make sense or issues that you ran into? If not, let's quickly go over some of this. So if you're really interested in kind of like the theory behind this approach, which, believe it or not, for something so simple, there's a lot of theory that goes into how this approach works. The HTMX.org website has a lot of really great resources. If you want to nerd out, check out the essays or check out, they wrote a whole book on this concept. It's really fun. It's really cool to go down. And if you don't really love JavaScript like myself, you'll really find it a breath of fresh air to look at how these things work. If you're looking for more of a practical example, you say, I don't really care about the theory. I just want to see how can I use this to make applications easily. Check out the code snippets on the htmx.org website because they actually show you like this is what the HTML looks like and this is the button that you can actually click and see how it works. The documentation has a lot of cool stuff. And if you're more interested in Flask, this wasn't a Flask workshop, but we used Flask. I've given a bunch of different Flask workshops over the past few years, and you can check out the code for my most recent Flask workshop there. And in that one, we created a more traditional multi-page application where, we're going to different pages, we're using links and forms and stuff. Not very fun, but, and I just want to show you really quickly this examples page just because of how great it is. As an example, if you have like 1,000 blog posts, say, right, you don't want to return all of them in the same list, right? Because that's stupid. You don't want to return all that HTML. So one thing you might want to do, and you might think, well, it's impossible with HTMX, is to have it so that when you scroll to the bottom, it loads more. But this is actually possible. So if we go here, you'll see in 3 attributes is all it takes. And you can see we scroll to the bottom and it grabs more and it just keeps doing it, right? In 3 attributes, if you wanted to do this in React, there's so much code that you would have to write to get it to work that it's ridiculous, right? And there's so much more, right? Like if you want to do validation of your forms, which is something that certainly you would want to do, you can see, you've got like these HX posts, HX indicator, all sorts of cool stuff you can do. So for example, in this form, if you put anything other than test.test.com, it'll fail. So let's put hi@mail.com and you'll see we've invalidated that form, right? But if we do test@test.com, then you'll see it validates, right? So there's a lot of really, really cool stuff you can do in such little code and with 0 JavaScript. I really recommend, you rethink how you look at full stack development, whether you're experienced and you've built a lot of React or Svelte or, even vanilla JavaScript before, or you're just starting out, right? You're learning about how to build web applications. You can see, you're getting a great user experience with very, very little code that you have to write, right? So that's about it. I'm going to stop talking because there's so much more we can go through, but that's about it for me. Thank you very much. Before we close, any questions, any comments, anything before we close? I see one. So the question was, when would HTMX not be better than React? And this is actually important because HTMX is not something you want to use for everything, right? A great example of this is, let's take the app Excalidraw, right? This is a really cool, I'm not sponsored, but this is a really cool like whiteboarding application that you can use for like drawing and making diagrams and whatnot. None of this is dealing with the server, right? So if you're not dealing with the server at all and everything is in the client and you're really focused on like, making your cool arrows and stuff, then you probably wouldn't want to use HTMX, right? If you recall, the whole point of HTMX is swapping out HTML with other HTML, right? So if you've got something like this, it's well defined, it's one page, and it's all kind of front end interactions. You've got no database, things like that. There's no sense in using HTMX. You probably could. I probably wouldn't recommend it though, because you'd probably be fighting against it more than you would be benefiting from it. Any other questions, comments? Well, thank you very much for attending this talk. And I hope, even though we've only gone a little bit into what HTMX can do, I hope I've at least given you guys some inspiration to check it out a little bit more and potentially integrate it into your future projects. Thank you very much.